And you're you're at Carleton, right?
I'm at Carleton. Yeah. Yeah.
That's such a great community.
It is. It is. It's been a really good place. I've been here my whole career, really.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, since 2000.
Welcome. If you are just coming in, be sure you say hello in the chat. I see several teachers from the LEAD program and EPIC teachers, so thank you for joining us tonight. Hello from New Hampshire, Jim, one of my favorite states. I'm gonna have a summer place there one day, I promise. Hello, Florida, Indiana, thanks for joining us. Abigail, Michigan. Florida, Michigan. Detroit is in the house. St. Cloud. Welcome, welcome. If you're just coming in, we are thrilled to have you here tonight. So welcome, especially to our LEAD teachers and our EPIC history teachers. More from Michigan, Ohio. Hello, Julie in Loveland, Ohio. Thank you for joining us. Well, Christopher, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of your town.
Ypsilanti.
All right. North Dakota. Hello, snowy North Dakota. I was hoping you were getting a touch of spring like our friends in Minnesota, but I guess not.
I think that snow that North Dakota is getting is headed our way, but like like Serena said, it'll be rain. It won't be snow.
Hello, Kimberly. All right. No. Mid-70s in Michigan, you'll take it, right? I'm in Florida, and I'm very happy to say that we've dipped down to the 60s at points this week to get away from that brutal heat, which I know is headed our way for a very long time. Well, I have 7:30 right on the dot, and we are thrilled that you're all joined us tonight. So welcome especially to our LEAD and EPIC history teachers and also to our wider NCHE members. We are here with Serena Zabin tonight, and I'm also joined by my co-host and colleague, Jessica, who is our executive director, and she is in Minnesota, and I'm here in Florida. We have lots of Florida, Michigan educators with us tonight. If you haven't said hello already in the chat, please be sure to do that. And welcome to everybody else who's joined us from around the US and abroad. As a reminder, we do offer regular webinars free of charge. So please invite your friends so they can join us and earn some professional development points along the way. You can register on our site, ncheteach.org/webinars. You'll receive 3 hours of professional development points, 1 hour for the webinar and 2 hours for the associated reading time. Our next webinar will be on April 26th at 7:30 Eastern with Sonia Pacheco, who's a librarian and archivist from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. She'll be presenting a pedagogy webinar on teaching American immigration history using primary sources. So that will be a great one for direct applications to your classroom. On May 10th, we'll be joined by Paul Ortiz from the University of Florida, and he'll be presenting on heroes and leaders in Latinx history. And then on our very next day, we have another webinar on the 11th. We'll be joined by Jared Ross, who will be discussing his book, Mutiny on the Rising Sun, a tragic tale of slavery, smuggling, and chocolate. So you won't want to miss that one. What an exciting title. We also have in the works a back to school series, which you might not want to hear right now, but we do have that in the works for September. So stay tuned for that. It'll be a great way to kick off the new school year. So tonight we are joined by Professor Serena Zabin from Carleton University in Northfield, Minnesota, where I hope that spring is starting to arrive, and she has assured me that it has, at least temporarily. Serena is the professor of history and director of the American Studies program at the university. She is the author of Dangerous Economies, Statues and Commerce in Imperial New York, and the New York Conspiracy Trials of 1741, Daniel Horst Manden's Journal of the Proceedings. She is also the co-designer of a video game about the Boston Massacre, which is in beta right now, and I will post a link to that in the chat if you'd like to check that out. And of course, she is the author of the book we're going to discuss tonight, The Boston Massacre, A Family History. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Serena. So a great welcome to you, Serena.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Thanks for having me. Thanks to all of you for being here. I thought that we would talk tonight a little bit collaboratively as much as possible with 60 people on a Zoom call. But I've done a lot of Zoom book talks, and I don't think that's really what anybody wants anymore. It seems very 2020 to me. So I thought that maybe we would start by my giving a little framing about what it is that, you know, we mostly tend to know as a general rule about the Boston Massacre, and a little bit about how that fits into Boston as a city. I know some of you are going there this summer. I'll show some maps, but I also want to talk some about this other side of the story of the Boston Massacre, some of which showed up in the chapter I had you all read. But also I wanted to give you a chance to see how I came to discover that story, because that really in some ways was a big part of the fun. So that's in those primary sources I asked you to look at. And I thought at that point we could talk about them together a little bit. So I will, I'm actually not positive that you all need to look at me for a super long time. So I think if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen with you and talk just a little bit about what we know about the Boston Massacre and how we might think about it as a family history, and what difference that makes to our understanding of how the American Revolution comes to have the meaning that it does. All right. So this is probably the way that almost everybody, you and your students and most Americans, and honestly, many people are not Americans, this is pretty much what people know about the Boston Massacre, partly because there's actually not a lot of images of the 18th century America that are still around. What there are some portraits, which tend to be overall not super interesting. So this image of Revere is, this image, not of Paul Revere, but that was engraved by Paul Revere, probably shows up in every textbook that any of you have ever seen. And it's this, they are all colored slightly differently, but they all look pretty much the same. And I expect that if you take a look at them or you think about teaching them, you know, you talk about it really as a very one-sided portrait of the Boston Massacre, right? Which it kind of is. What does it show? It shows some soldiers all lined up, shooting somewhat viciously this group of Bostonians who are fairly well dressed. If you look at them, the ones that are on the ground have blood pouring out of them. There's one woman in the middle with her hands up to her breast, which, you know, looking horrified, but also that single woman in the middle of a crowd is really supposed to tell people, oh, these Bostonians are like super safe people, right? Like a lone woman doesn't need to be afraid. With them, they're not really rowdy. And, you know, this is the story that the Sons of Liberty wanted to tell about how the shooting that happens in Boston in March of 1770, which I should back up to a minute, is really the fault of the British Army. So what we really know about the Boston Massacre, honestly, is not that much, which is surprising given what a big event it is. what we know is that on March 5th of 1770, there are troops in Boston. I'll talk a little bit about how they get there, why they're there, who do shoot in the street in front of what is the kind of center of power, right? What's now known as the old townhouse, what was then known as the State House, in front of the Customs House. They shoot into a crowd of Bostonians. 3 people die immediately, a 4th dies that night, a 5th dies later. We don't know why they shot. We don't actually know who gave a command to fire. All we know is that when the smoke cleared that night, everybody saw people dying and dead and bleeding in the snow. But nobody really knows kind of where the fault should lie, right? We don't know that. We've never been able to figure that out. All we know are the stories that people told immediately afterwards as they're all trying to shift blame on what happened that night. So this image of Paul Revere's is the one that's created by this group of radical men who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, and that they distribute in order to tell very vividly one side of the story. And, you know, one of the ways in which we know that this is really meant to be a piece of overblown propaganda is that label above the Customs House. They renamed it Butcher's Hall, right? This is the place where those butchers, who are these who are these British soldiers, were trying to defend, right? So that's their space, Butcher's Hall. But one of the ways that this works as propaganda that I think we've kind of forgotten, and maybe deliberately, I think people in the 18th century wanted to ignore, is this cloud of white smoke that's in the middle of this picture. And this white smoke really visually, as you can see, separates, it's right in the middle, and it separates the soldiers on the one side from the civilians on the other side. And that tells the story of saying, well, there already is a conflict between a British and an American side, that these two were already at war, right? And this is the first bloodshed of that war, but that they were already there. And that's the story, I think, that really isn't true. But by forgetting that this is also part of the propaganda, the part of the propaganda is to say, in 1770, Americans already identified themselves as in opposition and fighting the British Empire. That part was just not so. But if we think that that is so, it really misleads us into a whole story about what is the American Revolution, what is it about, where does it come from? At what point do people think, okay, this really is going to be a war? Turns out it's really not 1770. So, one of the things that I got really interested in, and we'll turn back to where this came from, is what the British Army looked like. Who are these people who are, in Boston in 1770? They come to Boston in late 1768. Here's a picture also engraved by Revere of them showing up in all of these big ships with these big British flags hanging off of them. They show up because Boston is the center of a newly organized customs office, right? Because the British government has decided after the 7 Years' War ends in 1763 that one of the things they're going to do is raise some more money to pay for administering and centralizing the empire. So all of these troops come. And when you look at this picture, you see ships, you see flags, you see this long line of red coats that are kind of marching down the Long Wharf. This is what's now the Aquarium, right into the heart of Boston. But if we think about what the British Army really was, and we look back at this picture, we see it's really a family institution. When the British Army marches, it marches, as you can see, with kids and with women, I mean, I was fascinated by the woman with the blue skirt, right? Who's like carrying a baby. She's got a kid by one arm, right? Her husband presumably is carrying another one on his back, along with all their like bedroll and everything else. There's a woman riding a donkey behind him. And there's our families who are marching and moving around the British Empire with the British Army. So when those troops show up, they actually show up with hundreds of women and children. And that, I think, is really important to the story. So this is what Boston looks like in 1769, right? So after the troops have come, before the shooting in that year. It's not a very big city. It's not that easy to tell from this map, but if you look at it with a kind of modern, stretched over a modern map, you can see that, you know, a lot of what is now Boston was then part of the harbor, or, you know, just sort of wetlands. That's what becomes the Back Bay. And at the time, Boston is a peninsula. It's only about a square mile. It's got about 16,000 people in it, which means really that it's about as dense. It was about as dense in 1770 as it is today, right? The population density, but it's just much, much smaller. So when these troops come, they are there because the governor asked for some help. There's no police force in the 18th century. There's some constables, but their job is really just to kind of keep the peace. It's not actually to enforce any kind of law. That's not their job. And so without a police force, most of the time, what kind of civil officials had to depend on were troops in peacetime, right? So they, the governor asks for troops. It's the British not at war in 1768, asked for troops to come and help keep order. And the two things he's most concerned about are both about this customs headquarters that are there. So one is that despite the presence of these new customs officials that are supposed to be collecting taxes on imported goods, there's a lot of smuggling going on, and it's not working very well. And secondly, there's a lot of unhappiness and anger at the presence of new customs officials who are there to enforce these new laws. And so there are a number of riots. And all of Britain, honestly, in the late 1760s and 1770s, Britain is a really sort of just riotous place at this point. There are numerous unending riots in London, but in many, many smaller cities as well. And magistrates are constantly worried about this unending rioting. Rioting happens in part in the 18th century because this is the way in which ordinary people show their displeasure. They actually politically acted out on the streets because so few people actually have access to, you know, the ways we think about doing politics now, right? Voting, speaking, they petition some, but mostly they perform their politics in the street, and that is rioting. So the governor asked for troops, the troops come, and then they have a problem of where to put these troops. So the place that they're supposed to live is on Castle Island, which is in the middle of Boston Harbor. It's still there. It still has a fort on it, although no longer active. And you can see from this map of Boston Harbor that it's a good distance. It's about 4 miles actually from downtown Boston. It's a very narrow channel that you can row there because I don't know if you can see where it says Dorchester Flats, which at low tide you can actually hike over, but that's 7 miles, so super far. So not convenient to put troops out on Castle Island. And this is, by the way, what if you are on Castle Island, Boston looks like. It looks really far away, not very big. If you really, really peer at it, maybe you can see that there's a couple of church steeples, and you see a mountain in the middle of it, which is now gone. But that is what we now know is Beacon Hill. That's where the watchtower was. It's where they put the beacon when they were, you know, lighting a fire up there to call to other towns for help. So the governor wants to take these troops and put them right in the center of Boston, right, where that red box is, like that's the heart of Boston. But the selectmen, whose job it is to, sort of organize the town of Boston, push back and they say, no, actually, the Quartering Act says that you can't just put troops into private homes. That's a misconception that we have about this sort of earlier part of the revolution. In fact, there is a Quartering Act. It's renewed every year by the British Parliament, but it's very clear that actually putting troops in private homes is a last resource. That first troops have to be put into barracks if there are any. Then after that, they have to be put into public houses, pubs. Only after that can the army requisition private spaces for it. This is super inconvenient, as you can imagine, for anybody who's trying to, move an army around. And so the officers are always complaining about it. And finally, in the middle of the war, they get it changed. But in 1770, there was no way just to stick them in private homes. There was no way just to take over space in the middle of the city. So the selectmen say, look, if you try to do that, officers, we're going to get you all cashiered. So they come up with this compromise because there's no way that the officers want to be staying out in Castle Island, and have to hike 7 miles through the mud every time they come to Boston. And instead, they end up renting spaces from Bostonians, right? So that's freely given. And you can see in this map, the blue squares are big spaces, sort of warehouses or other big areas that become barracks, right? That they rent and turn into barracks for multiple people. And these red dots are just some of the many, many homes that Bostonians rent out to soldiers and their families, right? So as you look at this map, you can see Bostonians and soldiers are all living together in 1768, 1769, 1770, when the shooting happens. And that's actually the moment that I wanted people to understand when I asked you all to read that chapter from the middle of my book, because one of the things that we see there are all of these relationships between men and women that develop through these living arrangements. And so I'm just going to skip through. It's what one park looks like, but to really one of my favorite images of all time, which I think, I'm not sure if that was in the chapter I gave you or not, but of women doing laundry at camp. And I always thought, who knew that doing laundry could be so much fun? It's so flirtatious. So, so we see here what a different picture of what it means to have soldiers in a city. And that's the part that I wanted us to unpack a little bit. So that said, I'm going to get rid of our images. And I thought that we could use some of the sources that I asked you to look at. As I said, to kind of open up some of the parts of the story that seem like we've known them, like they got fixed in stone, and what, which ones seem to us, or how we can learn some of these other stories about what was going on there. So I thought at this point, I might just open it up to folks and ask you what you saw in any of those sources. Maybe people, we can try it raising hands. I know with the webinar, it's a little strange, and I guess there's 70 some odd people here. So, but what do we see if people raise their hands? If I can see them or Shauna can, and we can talk about, I'm so sorry. The maps are, which I just saw, the maps are in my book, but there are also other versions of them that are online. The one that's not are the ones where I figured out where all these people were living. But that is in my book, and I can talk about those more. But I think I asked people to look at the let's see, a short annotated article, a long piece that describes, what the newspaper thinks happened the night of the Boston Massacre. And what else did I ask you? Sorry, and I had one other document. Oh, and the short narrative, which is a document I should describe that is put together by the town of Boston immediately after the shooting. So I'll just unpack this a little bit more for people who would like to know this piece of the story. As soon as the shooting is over, and this you do get from the papers, right? People are all horrified and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do. And there's sort of this all-night meeting in which the officer who is in charge that night actually turns himself into the governor, is put into jail along with a handful of soldiers that he had sort of let out that night to defend, and forgive me for not telling the story in order, to defend the sentry who was indeed standing in front of the customs house, and who's, I think everyone seems to agree, somehow is the butt of some kind of harassment by a bunch of teenage kids, right? How many there are, how much they harass him, that is absolutely open to question. But there's no question that he calls for some backup, and the backup is this officer, a guy named Captain Preston, and a handful of other soldiers. So they turn themselves in after the shooting, and the sort of Boston political establishment gets is deeply distressed, of course. They demand that the governor do something, and they say, we are also going to, actually figure out what happened here. We're going to start this trial immediately. So the next morning, they set up shop, and they just invite anybody who knows anything to come and give testimony. And they start doing that, and then the line is so long, they realize this is never going to work. So then they start sending people around to talk to people. They collect all of these depositions, and they put them together into a pamphlet with a frame, and that says, look, it's obvious that these soldiers were planning to shoot Bostonians, that this was a premeditated attack. And this is a pamphlet that comes to be known as the short narrative of the horrid massacre. They send it to London. They do their best to sort of win the PR war with it. So that said, I have lots of other things to collect here, but do people want to ask some questions about what's going on with the primary sources, or I can let, I see questions coming in the chat also. You can speak to some of those. But do people raise hands and ask any questions about the sources themselves and what you were expecting to see in them or hoping to see in them, or hoping that I would explain why I asked you to take a look at them? I can do that.
Serena, there is a question from Marlene. Can you revisit some of the reasons for rioting prior to the British troops being called in?
Sure. So, I'm just trying to think about it. How far we want to back this up. So as many of you know, through much of the 1750s and the early 1760s, there is a war, really a global war, but part of which takes place in North America between the British and a few of their native allies, and the French and a lot of their native allies, right? Which comes to be known here as the French and Indian War. We call it more generally the 7 Years' War, because it's also the war when, the French are kicked out of India. I mean, lots of territory changes hands around the world. But when the British win the war in 1763 and they sign the Treaty of Paris, they look around, they're like, wow, we suddenly have a much bigger empire than we did before. It's a lot of land, it's a lot of people, it's a lot of different people, right? Not just settlers we're trying to organize here. And so they start to try to figure out how are we going to make sense of this new enormous empire that we have. And a bunch of, essentially middle managers, what I think of as like those mid-level administrators, start coming up with plans to try to figure out how to rationalize and organize the British Empire, especially in North America. And so that's when they come up with the proclamation line. They're like, nobody's really seen a map of North America at this point. They're just like, let's just draw a line down what somebody said is some mountains and just say, we can't afford to keep the peace all the time between natives and settlers. So let's just try to keep settlers from bothering the natives and see if that will calm things down a little bit, right? So they're just throwing things at this problem. And one of the things that they decide they're going to do is centralize and organize this empire by putting all of the different ways in which they're collecting taxes, and especially collecting import taxes, into just a few places. And they decide Boston is going to be the headquarters of this newly revised set of taxes around collection for imports, which will include sugar, famously will include tea, right? But many other imports are going to be taxed and collected more carefully. And so these customs officials come to Boston to, run the customs office, and Bostonians are not pleased to have them there. And they're not pleased about this new way of organizing the empire. They are super pleased to be British. They're really proud that they kicked the French out. That makes them happier than almost anything else. But they don't actually think that the response should be that then there's going to be a new set of taxes and a new set of, administrators. They're kind of anti-administrators. They, the ways in which, at least in academia, we talk about administrative bloat. That's part of what they're doing there, right? They're like, who are these people? They call them the placemen, right? Who just get these jobs from the government, and, they spend the morning looking out the window, and then they have nothing to do in the afternoon, right? They're like, who are these people? And why are they taking our money? So there's a lot of rioting about, just their presence, but even more because they try to clamp down on the smuggling. And smuggling is, sort of just a way of not paying taxes, right? In every British port, there's lots of smuggling. There's no more smuggling happening in America than there is happening also of, smuggling of French goods that's happening in parts of Britain, but it's inefficient for the government. So they call in troops to try to sort of shut down the smuggling and shut down the rioting. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I loved your analogy to mid-level management. I think students can grab onto that and connect it to their assistant principals in a meaningful way.
I hear so.
Follow-up question to that. So knowing that quartering soldiers in private homes was a last resort, why was it so heavily regulated? And then why were they forcing soldiers or colonists to quarter soldiers in the first place?
Right. So it's really heavily regulated because the British have a long-standing anxiety about armies that dates from the 1680s and the Glorious Revolution, when they fear that the king just turned the army over into his own personal police force, right? So they start putting up a lot of guardrails about the degree to which the what they like to call the civil authority, right, has superiority over the military authority. And that's, actually a tradition that Americans have largely held on to, right? And so they put up a lot of guardrails about what the army can and can't do, and the ways in which it can and can't interfere with people's personal liberties. So they understand that when an army is on the march, it needs places to stay. They get that, okay. The idea is that they're supposed to stay in barracks, partly because army is often thought to be made up of, really rowdy people, and, they should therefore stay away from, decent settled people who live in areas and don't move around. So they don't even really want them near people's homes. But if there's places where there's no barracks, then they can requisition pubs, right? They can requisition public, that's why they're public houses. And so it's really only supposed to be when it's super necessary, when there's no other choice, that they would stay in anyone's private home. And they do this, same thing in Ireland, which is a place in the 18th century where, you'd figure the British government couldn't care less about how they're going to treat the Irish, who they see as perpetually in rebellion. But even there, they build barracks, right? Or they force the Irish Parliament to raise taxes to build barracks, but they don't put them into private homes. It's only out of dire necessity that they would go in homes, and most of the time, the civilian authority, right? Like, so whoever the governor, the selectman, whoever it is, they decide where soldiers go, not the officers. And that becomes a real problem, right? Officers, of course, don't like that. They want to be able to choose. So they, and officers are frustrated with Americans and how hard it is to get barracks out of them. It turns out, actually, those barracks in Massachusetts on Castle Island are super nice. They had just renovated them for the 7 Years' War, and the British officers in 1758, 1759, they put soldiers there. They're really happy with them, right? They write the selectmen these thank you notes about, how nice the barracks are. So the selectmen are, I think appropriately a little annoyed that 10 years later, people are saying they're not good enough. But also they're saying these are our rights. We know what our rights are. Our rights are that we already raised the money to build these barracks, and now you need to use them, right? I think we all know that story. But eventually it does become, when, especially after 76, I think it's maybe in 1778, that Parliament finally changes the law and says that it's up to the commanding officer where he wants to put troops, right? But at that point, they're well into the war. And so that's what starts to change. And that is what the Bill of Rights responds to, right? We just, read it back to an earlier moment, but that's not what's going on here.
Right, thank you. Heather has a great question, and she wants to know, how did the British react to the PR campaign from the Sons of Liberty?
That's a fabulous question, because the British, both the governor and General Gage, who is the commanding officer of all the troops in North America. He's at this moment in New York. He will eventually become the military governor of Massachusetts. But at this point, he's still in New York. They know perfectly well that this is going to be a PR fight, right? Because, 5 people die. I mean, I have a colleague who works on Central Asia, and he's like, that's like a morning's work, like for a drone, right? Like 5 people, and this is what's a massacre, right? And the Army knows that these PR campaigns can be really bad for them. There are other officers who have been found guilty of shooting into crowds, right? And have been either hanged or just barely, escaped because of a pardon, but have been found guilty by by courts already. So they are trying to get out also ahead of the PR war. So immediately, like the next day, I think, the minute that the general hears about it, which takes about 4 days, he writes to the governor and he says, you need to start taking depositions right now. And we need to start getting our own pamphlet organized, because they certainly will have one. And in fact, they take depositions from a few people who are, really deep into the, who are what they would have called friends of government, right? So good friends of the governor, right? some of those customs officials, many British officers, and lots of privates who tell these stories about how terribly they were treated by Bostonians. So they're full of stories that say things like, I was just walking down the street and this Boston guy just walked up to me and he just hit me. He just knocked me over. And then a whole bunch of other guys came and started pummeling me. And there's just tons of those, right? That are just all about the ways in which Bostonians are just these incredibly violent, vicious people who were just always spoiling for a fight with the soldiers. And in fact, the soldier story, that pamphlet makes it to London faster, right? They get it on a faster ship, they get it out there. And then for reasons that are sort of unclear, it doesn't get printed as fast, right? So the first story that gets out there is the one that is told by the Sons of Liberty. They very carefully send it to all of their allies, they think in Ireland and in Scotland, as well as to, whoever in the House of Lords they think will support them. And they're very funny. Then people start writing book reviews comparing the two of them, which are in the magazines. And most people are very eye-rolly about it. They're like, this is so obvious, right? That neither of these really represent any kind of truth, right? All of them see this as just a way of trying to shape a story. So I don't know the degree that anybody's fooled by them, right?
All right.
What I
Go ahead.
think, I think I can look at some of these questions too, and I'd love to talk about Christmas Addicts, and there's a few other things. But one of the things that I wanted to share with people, and maybe I can even put it on the screen if I can get the right piece of it up, is that those first pages of the Depositions, I think I can get this, which is this. Let me see if I can get the right one. Are you seeing the pages from the short narrative? I hope. One of the things that really caught my
Serena, we are
attention-
not seeing that one. We're
Oh, you're
seeing
not.
a Word document.
Oh, you're seeing a Word document. You really don't need to see my notes about what we're supposed to be doing here. I mean, I hope you all appreciate that I prepared for this, but I don't think that's what you wanted to see. Okay, here we go. Let's try again. Now?
Yes. We're
Yes,
able to-
okay. All right, so this is the short narrative that I just had you look at a page or two, right? That they print. It's very clear what's going on. This is the perpetuated, right, in that evening by these soldiers with an observation, et cetera, et cetera. And then here are what they called, and I think I saw some language there in the chat about, what we would call an affidavit now, but what they clearly called depositions, which were sworn to, but they're referred to in this narrative. And these are the first couple of depositions, and I shared these with my students actually for several years before I really paid, I think, a good enough attention to them. Some of it says, first sentence, I, John Wilm, lawful age, testify that about 10 days before the late massacre, Christopher Rumbley of the 14th Regiment was at my house in the north part of town with sundry other soldiers, and he talked a lot. And the point of this story, as you can see, right, he says, the Grenadiers Company was going to march up King Street, which is the central street, and that, he'd been in a lot of battles. He didn't know, but he might soon be in one here. The blood was soon run in the streets of Boston. Lots of threats, right? And it took me a long time before I started thinking, so if like soldiers and civilians, if Americans and British hated each other so much, like, why is this guy, why are all these soldiers in this man's house? Right? Like, what's he doing there? And then, you kind of go on and it says, and further, this Bostonian reports that he heard a soldier's wife named Eleanor Park say if there should be any disturbance in the town of Boston, and then if any of the people were wounded, she would take a stone in her handkerchief and beat their brains out and plunder the rebels. Super violent, right? Quite vicious. And, it was clearly included to show how totally violent and inappropriate is the word that's coming to mind, but it was stronger than that, right? Even women were who were connected to the British Army. But really it's this sort of story about how days and days and days before the shooting happened, this was planned. But when I read this, finally, I thought, like, what is this soldier's wife doing in this guy's house? Like, none of the stories that we know about the Boston Massacre talk about soldiers' wives. And when we start asking, what does it mean that soldiers have wives that are in Boston with them, right? That are traveling with them? How does that change what it means to live in a town? These people live together for 17 months. They marry each other. They talk about in that chapter. They become godparents for each other's children. They're not strangers by the time the shooting happens, right? They're neighbors. And that really unpacks lots of things about how we should think about this as a civil war, right? That really the Boston Massacre, I argue at the end of the book, is really the breakdown of this family, of the imperial family, right? It's like a bad divorce is what I call it. And that's what it ends up feeling like. And it's really only in these depositions that are really supposed to be about something else, supposed to be telling a story of premeditated violence, that you start to see traces of how these families end up integrated into a town and what means for this shooting. So that's what I wanted to, that's why I asked you to look at those pages, but I can stop sharing and go back to some other questions and pieces. Shauna, are there other ones in there I should try to?
Yeah, Jennifer wants to know if she's correct in saying to her students that the soldiers were not paid well and they had to take part-time jobs in their off hours.
Yeah, that is such a great question, because that is a piece that scholars have been talking about since, I don't know, I think the 1930s. And it is absolutely true that soldiers are quite poorly paid, are usually in debt to the Army, because all of their uniform and other things come out of their wages, right? They often still had more money than some young Boston men. Boston's in a depression at this moment, and there's actually also not a lot of men, most of whom died in the 7 Years' War. So it's a majority female population. So it's rough for them. They're not in the worst shape of anybody in the town at that moment. So it's not wrong that they were poor and that they worked for wages, and that they were allowed to moonlight, and we know that they did. And we know that, some of them were skilled artisans. Some of them are, hairdressers. We know people who work for wig makers, right? We know people who work in shops, and some of them are non-skilled. And so they're doing unskilled labor, like working famously in rope walks, which is part of the story that's in that newspaper. The part that we really don't know is whether Bostonians and Boston men are angry at them for undercutting them by agreeing to pay for lower wages. That's what that story usually says. And that's the piece we don't know. We don't know anything about the wages, right? Turns out some historian wrote this in the 1930s with no footnote, and then historians have been repeating it ever since. So I have a long footnote where I sort of walk through all the places where historians point to this, but we don't know that that's the cause of any of this anger. I don't think it really is, but we do know that they absolutely are integrated in many ways into places like Boston. They work for and with Bostonians. They marry them, they run away to go live with other Bostonians. I have a whole other chapter on desertion and the ways in which, when they disappear, the towns that they desert to often turn out to try to protect them when the army comes looking. So yes, you're not wrong to tell them that. It's just not necessarily a cause.
So Serena, I'm going to kind of combine a whole bunch of questions. And I see that there are quite a few comments on Paul Revere. And Paul Revere in many ways has become a mythical figure in American history. How did that really come to be?
Wow, that's such an interesting question. So Revere comes, I mean, he comes to have this mythical stature in part in the 19th century, as happens with Crispus Attucks, which I saw someone asked about, and I'm happy to go back to also, right? So, it's in the, somewhere between, the 18 teens and then really into the 1850s that that Massachusetts and Virginia start to have this argument about like where the real birth of the revolution is, right? And so it's at that moment, where's the birthplace of liberty? And it's at that moment that each starts to really burnish the reputation of many of the people who are involved in the revolution itself. And one of the reasons we know so much about Revere is he writes a really interesting, long, kind of memoir of his midnight ride, right? So, he writes it all out. He actually writes a couple of drafts. We have those drafts. They're in the Massachusetts Historical Society. So, he's making sure that people knew what happened, and what he did. And then, of course, as I said, these engravings are some of the few that, that we still have. So, so as an artist also, his work has continued. But a big piece of it is Longfellow, right? If it weren't for Longfellow, I'm not sure what we would know. But that's the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
Thank you. This is a great question from Heather. How does this depression that you spoke about compare to the one of the early 1900s with the Second World War?
Yeah, so I'm not a great economist, so I'll sort of throw this out there. But I would say overall, it's so much more local, right? So one of the things that's just sort of, so immense about the 20th century depression was that it was so widespread, right? It was everywhere, and it was hard to move from like one place to another and think that your luck is going to be a lot better, right? Some places people are looking for something else. They move because there is nothing, but they don't tend to find anything else. Economies don't work like that in the colonial period, right? So Boston's economy is really not in any way tied to, say, Philadelphia's economy, which is in much better shape in this moment, or Charleston's, right? Which also works really differently. So, so what you have in Boston is a place where really there's not enough labor, right? Because so many young men have died. There had been money that had come in from the 7 Years' War that disappears. And so shipbuilding had sort of, peaked, and then, all these people who were building ships are no longer finding work. But many of them are then moving to other places that are poised to become better places to work. Some of them in Massachusetts, Salem is one of them. So it's just much more local, if that makes sense.
All right, great. Can we go back to the question on Crispus Attucks?
Yeah, I think that's such a great one to look at, because Crispus Attucks, had a really important place at the moment of his death. Then he sort of gets forgotten, and then he gets picked up again, and then forgotten and picked up again. It's really fascinating story, right, of his own memory. So as you could see, I think, in the newspaper article that I gave you, he is identified by, his racial identity, right? So he's identifies mixed race, what they would have called mulatto, or what they did indeed call mulatto. Other pieces of his biographies, such as they put in there, we no longer think are correct, right? Among the many things that newspaper article gets wrong, it thinks it knows, who's going to die of their wounds. Kind of wrong about that, right? It's wrong about a number of things that happened. So it's maybe unsurprising that they don't know, where a ship was going and all of those sorts of details. But people see him immediately. They do tag him as a mixed race man, right? And one of the things that John Adams does in his defense of the soldiers, we haven't had too much time to talk about this, and I'll do it fairly quickly, but as I'm sure you all know or remember from the HBO series, which was beautiful, if slightly frustrating, is that John Adams is the Boston lawyer who defends both the officer Preston, who's in charge that night, and the privates, right? And it's clear the privates, somebody shot something, right? Because people die. So there's no question that there's some shooting, and he has to figure out some way to defend these soldiers. But at the same time, he is a hardcore son of liberty. And even more than that, he is a hardcore Bostonian. I mean, he really, even honestly, when he becomes president, even after he's lived in France, all of these things, he really believes that Massachusetts is the best place on earth. And, Braintree and Boston, those are where his heart is, right? So he is there to defend the reputation also of Boston. And so he's got to find some way to make an argument for those soldiers that they shot in self-defense, right? Because that's the only possible argument. But that they were not defending themselves against those rowdy Bostonians who would just walk up to a soldier and knock him down and call his mates over to beat him up, right? Because that's not the picture of Boston that he wants to put out there. So he's got this really tiny little needle to thread. And the way he does it is by saying, yeah, okay, there was a mob out that night. They were harassing these soldiers. But the thing is, those people, they were not the real Bostonians, right? They were, and this is different than the picture that we see from Revere. The picture that Adams is drawing in his defense is to say, those folks against whom my clients, the soldiers, had to defend themselves were all outsiders. They were Irish, they were Black, they were sailors, they were apprentices, right? They were Crispus addicts, but they weren't real Bostonians. So he plays that race card super early, right? And it works. It works for him, right? And then it becomes very hard for the Sons of Liberty to figure out how are they going to celebrate these people who were killed after John Adams just said that they're actually these outside agitators, right? So, fortunately, they managed the funeral before the trial, about 4 months before the trial. So they're buried without much, much angst about how do we position them. But the rest of the 19th century into the 18th century into the 19th century, it's very hard for Bostonians to figure out how they want to talk about somebody like Crispus Attucks. And the Massachusetts Historical Society, when asked to put up some kind of monument to them, they're like, why would we do that? They're hooligans. John Adams told us that. In the 1850s, there's a Black historian who starts to put together a wonderful book called Negro Patriots of the American Revolution, in which he's making this argument in Boston that Black people have always been part of the country, that they were there since the beginning of the Revolution, and so therefore Massachusetts should, join the abolitionist side and, start fighting this Civil War, even before it's actually war. And he's the one that really rescues Crispus Attucks' reputation. And that's where so much of what we know about Attucks comes from, is from that particular biography.
Fantastic. We are down
No,
to the
sorry.
final few minutes, and these questions have been great.
So many.
Patricia wants to know about the snowballs that supposedly started the Boston Massacre.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? How much, I mean, Matt, you all work with young people, right? Like, at what point is it appropriate to say, like, I was really afraid? So this sentry, right, says these young people were throwing things at me and I was afraid, right? And there's a whole big debate, even at the time, were they just throwing snowballs? Were there rocks in the snowballs? Was there ice with the snowball? Were there shells with it, right? Like, you know, what were they throwing? As though that's somehow going to explain whether or not it was appropriate for the soldier to call for backup, as though that's going to explain whether, you know, the ways that the next piece is escalated and a shooting happened is justifiable, right? It becomes a kind of a question about blame. So it's really impossible to know what they were throwing, right? We know there were people there, but should that have led to shooting? That we can never answer. And even at the time, there are Bostonians who are writing things like, we will never know the truth of what happened. And I think that's so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Serena, tonight. This was just fabulous. I grew up in the Boston area and I learned a lot of new things myself tonight. And thank you to all of our wonderful participants who really had incredible questions that really make me stop and pause and think, and hopefully the same for you. So thank you again for being here. I hope everyone has a great night and that you'll join us on the 26th. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks, Shanna.